Hey everyone, how's it going? So in today's video, we're going to pick up right where we left off in the last one. So I'll put a link to that somewhere on the video here. Just as a quick recap, if you're joining us now, in the last video, I showed how to use Azure to create a web application that we're seeing here. And then we used the deployment center down here to set up a GitHub Actions workflow that will build and deploy my application. And now that sounds like a whole lot, but if you go back and watch last video, it's pretty easy. So this is the workflow that the Azure portal put into my repository. It just does a simple build here. Let me zoom up. There we go. So it does a build with Maven, deploys it to the web app. Pretty simple because the application we're using right now is pretty simple. So today, though, we're going to build on this example because with our setup right now, we're deploying right into production. And if you don't already know, that's a big no-no because if our application took 30 seconds, a minute to start up, right now it's pretty quick because it's a small application. If it was any bigger, then we would have downtime for our end users because if we're deploying straight into production, and it takes a minute to start up on the server, then of course that's going to be downtime for your users. So what we're going to do is use the deployment slots feature on App Service. And I'll talk more about what that is, but essentially we're going to deploy to a staging site and then we can push our commits there because it's not production. It's just a staging environment. We can put all of our commits on there. And then when we're ready to do a release, we just come to the portal or use the Azure CLI, and then we just swap those two environments. And then that allows us to swap the environments without any downtime. So that addresses our downtime issue. And then it also makes it really easy to validate your changes before you commit them right into production because issues may show up in production that didn't show up during like your CI tests, for example. So let's go ahead and jump into the portal and I'll talk more about what app service slots are. So here we're in the portal. If we come down to the left-hand side, there's deployment slots. And when we open this up, I already have a deployment slot created here. If you're following along in your own portal, you'll probably just see the single slot running and it'll be labeled production, just like this here. So app service slots are their own independent web apps. So they can each carry their own configuration, their own app settings, etc. So that means our staging slot here, JSON Spring App Staging, could be using a different database because we could have separate app settings pointing to a different database. And then that also allows us to test changes in our staging environment. And then whenever we're ready, we just swap those two slots. And then the staging environment will go into production. And we can also set some configurations to make sure that when that happens, when we do that swap, that the staging environment is warmed up correctly and it's brought to our production scale. So that way we limit or totally eliminate any downtime. So I've already got a slot created here. If you're following along, you can click Add Slot, and then you just enter a name here. So I could have something like Staging 2. And then you'll notice that right here, you get a free domain name that's appended with your slot name right there. So again, that makes it really easy to test your changes. You can have your new builds running on a staging slot, and then you could send that to any stakeholders like QA, a product manager, and that way they can see it and play with it before it actually goes into production. So go ahead and create a slot, and then we're going to click into it here, and the blade that opens will look a lot like the overview blade for your main web app, and that's because, like I said a minute ago, each slot is its own independent web app. So we can come down to configuration, and this is where I was saying we could set different app settings here for different databases. So we could have a different database URL right here to point to staging. We could also increment my Java version to make sure that my application works with the newest Java version, and then I can swap that into production too. But that's all well and good. What I want to do in this video is recreate our CI/CD pipeline that we made in the last video. And I want to rewire it so that way it deploys to this staging slot here. So to do that, we're just going to go through the deployment center like we did before. And I'm going to point to my same repository and it'll commit a workflow into the main branch. The difference being that this time it'll deploy to my staging slot. So here we'll do simple Spring App, main, and then I'm going to add a workflow in the repository. So we talked about this alert in the last video because I already have a workflow in my repository. So the portal here is just warning me that you already have workflows in there. Do you want to add another workflow or do you want to just use one that already exists? So in this case, I want to add that new workflow. And then once it's added, I can delete this workflow that's right here because this is the one that's deploying straight to production and I don't want that. So now I'll click save. Let me just double check here. Yep, main branch, job 8, perfect. So I'll hit save on this. And that's going to commit another workflow in the repository. So it looks like we got a success here. So I'll back up to the workflows directory. And there we go. So you can see the file names look pretty similar, but now this one has parenthesized staging there. And that's telling you that it's now deploying to the staging slot. So if we come down on line 30, this tells me right there that this workflow in particular is deploying to the staging slot. And since this workflow getting added was a commit, we can see that that triggered a workflow. But now here's the catch. Right now I have two workflows. One of them is deploying to production and one of them is deploying to staging. So what I'm going to do is come back to workflows, go to the workflow that's deploying to my production environment, and I'm just going to delete this one. So we'll come here. Yep, and then delete this guy. So you may be asking, like, why did we set that up in the first place in the first video if we were just going to delete it? Really just instant gratification. So you could see that the GitHub Actions workflow was working correctly, and you get that nice feeling that your code's deploying and everything's working nicely. And deploying to production is fine for a proof of concept application or a demo tutorial like this, but want you guys to follow best practices whenever possible. So now let's go to the overview blade here and we'll go to actions. Perfect. So here, this is when both workflows ran just a minute ago when the new workflow was added. So you can see here, this is the one that deployed to staging. So if I click into this guy, let me also blow this up. And we go to the steps here. And if we go to the last deploy to Azure Web App, we can see here, perfect. Yeah, so it's deploying to the staging branch now. Excuse me, deploying to the, excuse me, the staging slot. So let's validate that that's working. So perfect, there. This is my JSON Spring App dash staging. We can see that the app deployed because we're seeing the text there. So now we can run the workflow through its paces just like in the last video. I'll go to the controller over here. We'll just edit this guy. Hello from Azure App Service in the staging slot. Cool. So that was a commit right there on the main branch. When we come over here, we can see that that's kicking off the staging workflow. And since we deleted the previous workflow that was deploying to production, we're no longer going to see that running here. The last time it ran was about a minute ago. So while that workflow is running, what we should see is on my staging environment, once it deploys, we'll see hello from Azure App Service, and then in parentheses, we'll see that from the staging slot. And then on the production site, which we can get to by just removing -staging, it'll just stay as hello from app service, because this is where all of my users in a real world example would be going to. And then I can deploy all of my changes, all of my new features to the staging environment. And then once that passes QA, then I can swap these, which we'll do in just a minute. Okay, so here we can see that the workflow ran. So the jar file was deployed to the staging slot, and there we go. See, this is what I was saying, was that our application is just a simple demo app, so it starts up like that. And deploying to production in that case isn't a huge issue, but you want to set yourself up for best practices. Okay, so here we go. This is what I was saying on the staging environment. It says hello from the staging slot. And now when we go over to production, we don't see that, right? So now what we're going to do is come over to our main app. And now we're going to do the slot swap. So this is what I was saying a minute ago, where we can deploy our changes into the staging environment over here. And then when we're ready to release those to production, we just come to the portal here. We hit swap, and in the dropdown, I only have the one staging slot, so I'm just going to choose that one. And then the target, since I'm swapping my staging to production, now target is the production slot. And then here I have some config changes. So here is where if I make any configuration changes in my staging environment, and I wanted those to get transferred over to production, I would see that here. Now, the app setting that we're looking at right here doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit swap. But this table right here, down on the bottom right, is where you would see essentially like a diff of all of your different app settings and configurations. So if you wanted to update your Java version, so if you were running on Java 8.252 and you wanted to update to 253, then you can make that change on your staging slot and then validate that your application is working correctly on that new Java build, and then come here and swap your production and staging slots. Okay, cool. So the swap went through, so we can close this. And now if we come over to the production site, you can see here now it says, hello from Azure App Service in the staging slot. So if I had done more changes, like if I had a front end and I updated the layout, then we would see that reflected here. So this is just a real minimal example. And now if we go back to staging, we can see here now we have the old build. So if my CI system was running and we pushed more commits, they would deploy into this staging site here. And then from there, once I have more commits in my staging site and a newer build, then I can just swap that in again, and then the workflow just continues from there. Now, one of the other cool things to do with app service slots is traffic routing. So you can do testing in production or A/B testing with app service slots. So right here in this traffic column, originally the top production slot here had 100% of the traffic routing to it. And that's kind of what you would expect, right? You want all of your traffic going to production typically. But if you want to route a smaller percentage of your traffic to that new build of your site, so you can validate that things are working, you could do A/B testing, you could compare telemetry like page load time or API response times, then you could send, like right here, I'm sending 10% of my traffic to the staging site. And that way I can continuously test my latest builds in the staging environment before I swap them into production. Now, that's kind of an advanced scenario, but if your team has the resources and you guys want to set up monitoring on your applications, then you could also set up alerts where if the page load time or those request response times are getting too high on the staging site, then you know that you probably shouldn't swap it into production just yet. There might be an issue in that latest build. Okay, so I think that covers everything. Again, let me know in the video comments down below if there's anything else you want to see covered. I've got an agenda here for the next 3 videos, but I'm always happy to take requests. So thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something.